Okay, so first things first, sample selection. Much like many other aspects of music production, the end result is almost completely dependent on the quality of the content being used. And it's the same with drums. So if you're using weak sounding drums, then it's not going to be possible to make them sound deep and resonant and have that meaty goodness that we're also used to hearing on the radio and in clubs. So picking the right samples or getting good sounds out of your drum synth is the first step to getting a good drum sound in your tracks. Because of the quality and scope of drum libraries these days, it's not absolutely necessary to synthesize all of your drums. So if you're looking for hats, snares, percussion, even kick sometimes, then you'd be hard pushed to make better drums than what you can find on a good quality sample CD. But that's not to say you should not get into synthesizing drums. If you're interested in that and it helps you be creative, then you should do it or at least try it. But if you're like the majority of people I teach and you just want to get on with making music, then you may just want to stick to using samples at least at the beginning until you find the need to start customizing some of your sounds. And once you do get a bit further into music production, you will most likely find that you do want to personalize some of the sounds you use. So for me, it's always the kick. So I always use a synthesized kick, or at least partially synthesized. And everything else I use samples for. But everyone's going to have a slightly different idea of what they want and how far they want to go with customization. So the samples, like I say, being of such good quality these days, I find that layering two good sounds together, let's say like two good snares together, can yield better results most of the time and more unique results than using a drum synth. But again, it's not up to me to tell you what to do. That's just sort of, the process that works best for me. So I want to talk about kick synthesis particularly. Now, the kick, of course, is one of the most important elements in dance music. It provides the main rhythm for the track, and all the other rhythms, any hats, shakers, whatever, all dance around the kick. Everything plays around the kick. It is the most sort of fundamental part of the dance music track. So this is why a lot of artists will always choose to synthesize their own kicks, or, really spend a lot of time at least working on the kick and making sure it's absolutely perfect. There's a few things that we need to look out for, like tuning and stuff like that. The kick needs to be tuned, but we'll get into that in a bit. So at the moment, I just want to talk about kick synthesis, and we're just going to make a kick in Metrum. So this is Metrum. Now, rather than being like a pure drum synth, this is pretty much solely a kick-making machine with sort of synth capabilities. And these days, the lines between synthesized sounds and sampled sounds are becoming ever more like blurred. So Metrum is a prime example of this merger between synth and sample, and with it you can get some really awesome results. There are other like kick sort of synths or whatever, or kick machines like Big Kick, which is a really good one, and much cheaper as well. I think it's only like 30 quid. And you can pretty much do everything that you can do in Metrum. It's just not quite as rounded out and stuff, but you can still get amazing results out of it. So I'll definitely recommend Big Kick if you're looking for a drum machine or a kick machine and don't want to spend too much money. But I'm going to show you in Metrum just because it's got better graphic sort of overlay of what's going on. So just a brief overview of Metrum very quickly. Down here, the side here, you've got the layer section. So layer 1 is an oscillator section. So this is the synth part of it. And then the other 3 layers are all sample-based layers. Obviously, there's nothing in there at the moment. There's no samples. But this is where you sort of get like the main sort of shape, the fundamental part of the kick created using the oscillator. And then you can add extra sort of kick samples. They're usually like top samples. So I'll just show you quickly just so you know what I'm talking about. So things like that, and you can use it to layer up with what is actually, coming out of your main oscillator, which is what's playing now. So before I get into kick synthesis, what I want to do is just actually analyze a kick. And the frequency response and how many parts of the kick is sort of made up of. So I'm just going to load up Fab Filter Pro Q2 because it's got a handy little function down here, the little keyboard. So if I drop a point on there, just disable that so it doesn't actually affect the EQ. And then if I move it about, you can see at the bottom there, it actually tells you exactly what key it's in. Or you can look up there on the little pop-up window. Okay, so when you're analysing a kick, there's basically 3 parts to it. There's the initial sort of snap, which is usually like a mid-range type frequency to mid to high-end frequency. And that provides like what you call maybe like the click of the kick, or the snap. I wouldn't go as far as to say air. Air you usually add through adding like a noise oscillator or a noise sample or whatever. But it's usually like, the mid-range sort of snap. So if you can hear it on that, it's like the initial just hit. Playing around there, so if I boost that, you can really hear the snap coming out. Then you've got the thud, the sort of deep resonant thud, which is part of the first part of the attack. And you can see there in the waveform where it's much more compressed. That's really the sort of main thud of the kick. And if I just play around with the actual pitch envelope, you can make that thud a bit longer or more prominent. So that's the mid-range thud, and that's usually around about here. So if I use one that's active, so you can hear there, if I'm boosting that, you can really tell that's the mid-range part of the kick. And like I say, that happens, that's like right at the beginning here. That's all this compressed sort of waveform there. It's providing most of that thud. And then further on, the third part of the kick, and the most important part if you're going to tune any part of your kick, or if you're only going to tune one part of your kick to the rest of your track, this is the most important bit to tune. And that is the sub part of the kick. So what the kick resolves to, so we can see here, this is the pitch oscillator just showing me what's going on here. And you can see at the start of the kick, the pitch is very high, providing that kind of snap. And then it just drops down, or it resolves into this frequency here, which is obviously quite a bit lower. And as I play it, you can see that. You see this peak here actually hits slightly before that peak there. So this peak happens a bit quicker, because it's happening first, obviously, and then the sub tail of the kick is coming in. And you can see there, if I boost that, obviously it makes the sub part of the kick much more prominent. And this is really, that is, like I say, the most important part to tune. So if you are going to tune only one bit of your kick, then you want to tune this one. So I'm going to get into tuning sounds in much more detail later on in the tutorial, but you can't really talk about kick synthesis without talking about tuning the kick. So like I say, I mean, the mid-range frequency, or the high-end frequencies and the mid-range frequencies, aren't perhaps quite so important to tune. You certainly can, and certainly a lot of people do tune their entire kick. So all of the sort of peaks coming up are tuned to exactly the same note, or is in at least exactly the same scale as each other. But it's not so important. You can do it, and it can sound good, and you may do it, and it may not really make that much difference to your kick. So a lot of house producers do that. But again, the most important frequency to make sure it is tuned is the sub frequency. So this down here. So let's just sort of find the peak of the sub, which I would say is about there. So that's telling me it's sort of F sharp. So if I want to change that, I can change it in here by changing the pitch. And you'll notice as I raise that up, you can hear that you can see the waveform moving around there. So what I actually want to do here is, this is the handy thing about having a FabFilter Pro Q. I believe there are a couple of other EQs out there that can also tell you musically where the frequencies are. So if I want my kick to be like, I don't know, up in B or something, let's say, then I can just set my point in the EQ, and I can just raise that up until the main peak there is around about B, sort of thing. So I know that if the rest of the track's in B, then I know my kick is going to also be in the correct tune, or at least the sub of the kick is going to be in the correct tune. Now, that's a bit of an extreme example. You don't normally need to tune a drum that far. So for some particular styles, when it comes to tuning kicks, a lot of times you won't need to actually tune the kick to the very root note. So let's say your track is written in G minor. You don't necessarily have to tune the kick to G. It could be any note that's actually in G minor. Particularly, it's always good if you can do it to a fifth note, or maybe even a seventh note. So you don't have to change the key of the kick too much. You know, maybe just do like 3 semitones in either up or down direction. So it shouldn't affect the kick too much. It's important to remember that you don't have to tune to the actual root note all of the time, unless you're in a genre like hardstyle where the sub part of the kick is pretty much the bass line for the track, or plays an extremely prominent role in the bass line, in which case then you want the sub part of that kick to be in the root note of the track. But for things like house where the kick's much more snappy, then you still want to tune the kick, but you only need the sub part of the kick to be in a note that's in the scale that the track is written in. You don't want the sub part of the kick to be falling on a note that isn't in the G minor scale. If you do, what's going to happen is you may not even hear it at home unless you've got really good speakers that have a very, very clear, punchy low end, that things like this become obvious. But when you go and listen to it in a club and you play it on a loud system, then suddenly it's going to become incredibly obvious that the kick is actually in the wrong key, and it's going to really sound bad. So now I've sort of covered that, let's just have a little look. So there's 2 main types of modulation, one of which I've kind of just talked about, which is a pitch modulation. And of course the other is amp modulation. So using an envelope, which is the ADSR, so you've got attack, which is up here, the attack of the waveform, the decay, the sustain, and the release. So of course, pretty much all synths have ADSR envelopes on them, but a lot of them aren't quick enough to actually to make drum sounds. Some are, so you can make drum sounds with them, but most are, if they're just for making leads and bass and all that sort of stuff, then most of them don't have fast enough envelopes to actually make kick sounds out of. So that's why we normally have dedicated drum synths. So with the amp envelope, obviously what we're doing is making the shape of the kick. So I can make it longer, turn the sustain up, turn the decay down, whatever I want to do, sort of thing, just to shape the kick so it's correct for my particular track. And there's one thing about attack, the attack of the kick, obviously with the attack fully sort of open, if you like, you get that sort of, real clicky sound at the beginning, which is fine. You might want that in your particular genre. But if you want something more deep housey, perhaps, then if you bring back the initial attack of the kick, then you're going to get slightly sort of softer sound, which suits obviously deep house and minimal and, any genre like that, really. Okay, so there's not really much more with respect to the amp envelope that you can talk about. That is purely just the shape of the kick. So the pitch I've already kind of covered, but I will just go over it just very briefly again. So the pitch of the kick pretty much always starts off high for that initial snap, drops down to where we've got our main thud part of the kick. Like I say, I can make that thud much more prominent by extending that. And then it drops down and resolves into what will be our sub frequency. And we can set that obviously, so quite handy in Metrum, you got that little pop-up window to the side there which says, B, so I know it's in B2. So I can sort of start tuning that so it's with the rest of my track. And if I wanted to, obviously I could just drop all of these, and if I do that, then we get just pure sine wave. And then we put our initial attack in, our thud, and then choose the frequency we want the kick to resolve to. Again, always in tune with whatever your track is written in. Okay, so that is just a very sort of basic look at how a kick is structured and how to create one just out of a sine wave. Okay, so let's just go through in Metrum and just make a few different sort of kicks, or mainly the body. So I don't want to get into layering. Usually to make a full sounding kick, you probably want to add more than just the one oscillator layer. But I don't want to get into layering just yet. We're going to be covering that in much greater detail later on in the tutorial. So let's just make a few different kick bodies. Now you'll recognize them straight away. And all we're going to do is be modulating or changing the pitch envelope and the amp envelope. So obviously we've got quite a house sounding kick there, which we can just tweak to get exactly the right kind of sound. But let's say I want like a sort of more hard style kind of kick. For that we need to make this a little bit longer. Okay, so simple as that. Change the pitch modulation and the amp modulation just to make the kick a little bit longer, but mainly, of course, using the pitch. It's just that simple, just to create a completely different sounding body. Now, of course, like I said, I wasn't going to start layering in things, but of course you can. So you get the idea of what can happen when you start adding extra layers to it as well. But for now, like I say, I just want to concentrate on the main body of the kick, or the one oscillator section, just to show you how easy it is really when you start modulating the pitch to get these different kick sounds. So it's not like a really complicated thing to actually make your own kicks. So, okay, let's make what would be maybe a trancey kick. Let's make that envelope a bit shorter. Even something like that already. So just changing these parameters, like I say, I mean, obviously you want to mess around with them as much as possible, and really craft the body for the kick. You get some very sort of cool minimal kicks out of that. So that's really as much as I want to show you on that. I mean, like I say, I don't want to bring in the layers too much now. We're going to be talking that in much more detail when we're actually bringing in samples. So as a whole, I mean, that is kick synthesis in a nutshell. But it really is kind of that simple. You can just play with the pitch, get the sort of kick sound that you want, or at least the body, and then just add to that. And of course, kick synthesis has the benefit of being completely controllable, so I can really pick what key I want the kick to be in, which is very, very important for a good quality sounding track. You need your kick to be tuned. Let's just quickly have a look at another one. So I'm just going to load up Big Kick. Just route that through. So obviously Big Kick is a little bit simpler than Metrum, hasn't got quite the same interface. and it hasn't got quite the same sort of functionality as Metrum, but it's still really good, and the quality of the kick samples, or the kick sounds that you can get out of it, are also top notch. So I definitely do recommend this plugin for people that are on a slightly lower budget. So of course you're going to have tons of presets. And so in Big Kick, you've got 2 layers instead of 4. You've got one sample bass layer, which I'll just turn off, and then you've got the body layer, which again is a synth. So again, the most important modulators in Big Kick are for the body, for the synth section, for the synth layer, are amplitude and pitch. So again, obviously attack, very straightforward. You turn the attack right up and you get that click, which generally is actually not too desirable because it can make things a little harder to mix later on, because you've got that initial peak. You kind of want to keep that out there if you can. And of course your hold, so I can make that much shorter or longer. And then the decay at the end of the kick. So you've got a few different functions in the pitch section. So you've got deepness, which, as it says, keeps the pitch decreasing all the way through the note, removes any hint of absolute pitch from the drum. So, and you can actually see it happening there. So when the deepness knob is turned down, you've got quite a consistent waveform, which means that the sine wave that's playing has a defined note. But as you turn it up, you can see it kind of stretching out, which means that the sub part of the kick is always going down. There's no like one pitch note for it. It's always diving down, which I guess would make it slightly easier to tune. Or well, it probably will have a slight musical center, so you'd probably still want to tune that. Then you've got curve, which basically is just adding the amount of thud and initial snap to the kick. And you got, of course, the starting pitch, which is this. So I can have it right up, have it nice and snappy, or have it very deep by having a lower starting pitch. And then you got the time. So as it says, controls the duration of the pitch decay. So if I turn it right up, it means the pitch is going to take longer to decay, or from the starting frequency. Or if I turn it right down, then it's going to dive from the initial starting pitch very quickly to a low pitch. And then you got basically what is the resolving frequency, so you can just set the lowest frequency that the kick will go to. So anyway, that's just a very brief overview of Big Kick, but I just want to sort of show you that that's out there. It's pretty much as manipulable as Metrum. It's just a bit different. Instead of having a graphical display, you've got knobs instead, but you can achieve all of the same things through it. So, of course, apart from synthesis, how else do you get drums? Of course, there are samples, and there are literally millions of samples available to us these days. Some of the more popular ones are like the Vengeance sample banks or the Loopmaster sample banks. And really, personally, I rate them on usability. And I find, particularly the Vengeance samples are just super usable. Really, really good samples. And, don't get me wrong, I don't get any commission for recommending them. It's just literally what I use for most of my one-shots, at least. And loops and stuff. The loops are fine if you want to, like, chop up loops and use different parts of them, so on and so forth. And the same goes for Loopmasters as well. They're probably the two main ones that I use. Although I do, bring in other sample banks of, more peculiar instruments. If I want like djembes or something like that, then, or cabasas, then I'll bring in a different sample bank, one that's specifically for that, and probably from a different company, whatever. So before we move into the rest of the tutorial and start talking about everything else, I just want to briefly go over how we actually use the drum samples in our sequencer of choice. And I want to talk about using sampler instruments for one-shot drums versus audio. So obviously just dragging in an audio sample. So using audio samples like that, or having a MIDI track, loading up something like Contact, which is, if you don't know, is a sampler. So basically what I can do is I can literally take an entire folder of samples, say all hats, and I can just load them in. So this is a pre-made instrument. I've already made this instrument, but it basically means that along my keyboard, every single hat is then mapped to a different key. So I just want to show you, I'll talk about the sort of benefits of either one. Now, these are the two main ways that I get audio into my projects. Of course, you can use other things like Native Instruments Battery or Groove Agent, which is built into Cubase, and other such sort of like drum sequencer type programs. So what's the benefit of using MIDI over audio? So once I've got all of my samples loaded into this instrument, so let me just show you quickly what I mean by that. So if I just bring up the settings, so you can see there on the keys, so from C1, C-1, all the way up to G sharp, I've got hat on every single key, a different hat on every single key. So the beauty of using MIDI to audition your samples is that I can literally just select the MIDI, hit the arrow key, and I can just cycle through all of the samples, and I can just check them out as it's playing in the track. So this is particularly helpful if I've got, a track that's like, say, half complete or whatever. If I have audio then, and I want to replace the hat, I decide suddenly that I don't like it, or I want to put another one in, then I've got to literally go through in audio and replace every single hat. So I've got to copy and paste an entire track's worth of hats out, which is a right pain. So the easiest thing to do is if I suddenly decide, if it's a MIDI and I decide that I want to change the hat, then I can literally just select one line of MIDI, go into the whole lot and just change the hat, and I can do it while the track's playing, which is another benefit, because of course with audio, generally you have to either audition something in Cubase in the media bay. Our loops, fine, that's okay, they'll just play in time. Cubase sorts all that out for you, so you can audition them in real time on the loop bay. But with one-shot sounds, of course, although I can audition one-shots in Media Bay and just drag them onto my project if I want. So if I just got a simple rhythm like that, then obviously if I want to change that, what I have to do is audition another sample. So I want to replace it with that little clap sound, bring that in, and then I have to literally copy that pattern. And then if I've got, say, 10 bars of this, then I have to then copy that all across, so on and so forth. But if I have that in MIDI instead, so let's just put in a little pattern instead. So now I've got that MIDI pattern in there, so I can just go into the MIDI, and instead of having to redraw everything, I literally just hit the up key, and then and of course it doesn't just have to be that one hat as well. I could be using a variation, and I can just change the whole lot. And like so, I can just go through and change everything very nice and easily. And again, with MIDI as well, this is another benefit. What I can do is actually select, obviously, two MIDI parts. So I've got the kick and my little sort of hat rhythm there. Let's just mute the other bits that we've got going on. So I've got my kick and hat rhythm selected, both MIDI parts. I can just double click on that and I can go into it, and then I can actually see both there. So if I want to program in a drum rhythm and I've got like a clap, a kick and a snare all on different instruments, it doesn't actually matter, because I can just select all the MIDI in one go into it, and then I can modify my kick or the hat loop or whatever it is, and I can see all the drums laid out there. So it's kind of like having like this sort of simple drum sequencer that you got in Fruity Loops, that type of thing. And down here, of course, you've got all your velocity parameters, so you can change the initial volume of everything, and so on and so forth. And of course, later on, if I really want to, what I can do is just highlight a bit of MIDI. If I want to turn this into audio, go to Edit, Render in Place. And then it literally just bounces out. So now I've got that in audio, so then I can sort of start chopping things up and I can start editing those bits if I want to. So what are the benefits of using audio instead? Okay, so the only benefit really is the fact that you get to manipulate every single sample that you've got there. So let's use the other one. Let's use that one because it's a bit longer. So let's say they've got a bit of a reverb tail on those ones, those samples. Just turn off my snap. And let's say I only want the reverb tail to be on that first one. So I can then shorten, change the envelopes, or I can give that one a bit more attack. And things like that, editing becomes much easier. So there are benefits to both approaches. But I'd say overall, especially when you're starting to actually make the track, it's definitely easier if you can load things into a sampler. So if you're using Logic, of course, you've got the XS24, fantastic. So you can just load all your samples up in there. If you've got Cubase, Groove Agent SE, which is a free sampler stroke drum machine that comes with Cubase. And it's actually surprisingly powerful. In fact, one of our tutors, Mike Smith, has just done a really awesome tutorial on this. So if you do want to know more about Groove Agent SE, then I would definitely recommend you going and checking that out on our site. I'm using Contact, which is one of the better ones, but you can get cheaper, cheaper samplers that you can still do the same sort of thing. So, and of course, if you don't, then fine, just stick to using audio. And I used just audio for years, and occasionally I still do, even though it's a bit of a pain to change it sometimes. So there's no real problem, but it's nice having the editability of pure audio. So, okay, that's that done. I just wanted to cover that briefly, just have a little look at what the sort of benefits of either are. Of course, if you want to use things like Groove Agent or Battery, whatever, that's no problem, just go for it. You know, if it helps you be creative, then use it for sure. But I just wanted to show that because using MIDI in a track can really be mega helpful.